This podcast is brought to you by Die Macher from Spielworks. Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is an educator, videographer, puzzler and game designer. Probably best known in the gaming world for designing Santorini, he's also part of the website Mathpickle, a resource for teachers introducing puzzles into the classroom intended to bridge the gap between ability levels. He also has a series of videos on YouTube that are completely beyond my ken. My guest this week is Gordon Hamilton. Gordon, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Hi, Ben.
And so to begin, and I think I sort of have an insight into the answer to this because you wrote it in the email. How difficult was it for you to choose the games to take to the cabin?
It was absolutely excruciating. I labored over this for a good 2 hours.
And why was it so excruciating?
As if I didn't have anything better to do, right? So it was excruciating because there were many games that fell off the list. My son, who with the two of us adore playing Reiner Knizia's The Lord of the Rings Confrontation. That would be our game. It would be our game for the last 10 years. So he was kind of insulted that I hadn't included that on my list.
Yeah, I think I felt slightly omniscient in this one. You're the first guest. You sent me 6 games and told me to roll a d6 and decide which game to kick off the list. And I can let the listeners know that the game that fate decided was not to be in this was A Feast for Odin. How did you feel about that one being kicked out?
Well, that's the only one I hadn't played, and I thought that if I was to go to a cabin, that I really needed to have a game there that I needed to learn from scratch, because I enjoy learning games from scratch and playing them, and it had a lot of time. I wanted it to be a pretty meaty game, so that's why I chose A Feast for Odin, not through any idea that I would love the game, but I think I probably would.
I mean, when you say learn the game from scratch, what do you mean? Do you mean learn the mechanisms, or do you mean learn how to play the game, how to be good, how to achieve things?
Well, I haven't even picked up the rulebook, so I know nothing about it other than people have said, oh, this is a good game, you should try it. So, it's really learning it from scratch.
I mean, because I detest reading rulebooks. I hate learning games. I wish I could just distill the rules of the game into my head so they could sublime away. And I could get to that point where everyone sits around the table and just knows how to play, and then the game is allowed to speak to you, you know.
So normally I would watch a YouTube video to learn video instructions. But whenever I'm left by myself in a cabin for eons, then it's okay for me to have a rule book that I have to struggle through.
And so, I mean, how do you value games as artifacts? Do you value them as utilitarian things? Do you like components? Because you designed Santorini, which in its second iteration is incredibly pretty. Would you be sad at the loss of the actual artifacts, or is it the potential experience that they can yield?
Well, I love games to just play face to face. I would like to beat my opponents and to have them beat me. I love the gaming experience. Cuddled around a table with a glass of wine or beer. I love that. Now, I could say that as an artifact, the instructions for the game Go could be summarized in a page. I think that's the single most important artifact that the human race has yet created. It is such a beautiful game. It's not one of the ones on my list, But that to me is the greatest thing that humanity has come up with yet. The greatest succinct thing that humanity has come up with yet.
And when you say the greatest thing, I mean, do you include that with, the great novels, the great poems, the great plays, the great movies?
Yes. But it's the succinctness of those rules that is truly fantastic. I would love to have preserved more of the plays of Sophocles. That's not going to happen. I think 80% of those were lost. The succinctness of those rules of Go, that's what's awesome.
I mean, before we recorded, you said that you were very eager to assert that you're human first and mathematician second. But do you think there is a mathematical beauty about Go? Does it say something to you as a mathematician?
I think that there's an aesthetic to Go that appeals to many mathematicians. Whenever I'm over in the math class, in the math faculty at the University of Calgary, I would find that Go is on the table as much as chess. I think Go is a far superior game to chess, but the history of both is very interesting, is equally interesting for both of them. But I think that Go does appeal to mathematicians for its purity of expression. I know that some great mathematicians have worked on the end game of Go and have got it to the point that they can set up a game situation that will beat all top Go players. But that's a very specific end game configuration. It's Berlekamp who has done that work.
But I suppose it's the journey to that end game situation is what makes the top level Go players, right? But so where do you stand? The way you talk about Go is not the way a lot of people talk about games. Where do you stand on the question of games as art? I'm always very keen to defend them as being their own sort of art form, and yet there seems to be quite a resistance to that. Where do you stand on it?
I'm 100% with you. I think that games are an experiential art form. I think they're one of the most enjoyable experiential art forms. I would place them just after music as being my favorite art form.
And so what would be I know I'm stepping on Radio 4's toes here, but what would be the album you'd take with you so you had music and games?
Okay, I will say two on the extreme ends of the classical music spectrum. I will choose Victoria's Requiem. That is a piece of Renaissance music that absolutely is spectacular. Victoria only composed sacred music, and I am not a religious person, but that music speaks to me. And on the opposite end of the spectrum would be Shostakovich's Symphony No. 4. I think that is a masterpiece. It's nasty music. You don't want to be living his life whenever he wrote that music. He was under Stalin, and that's an ugly but awesome piece of music. Now, I won't say ugly. It's a nasty piece of music. You can feel the fear when you listen to that.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this the other day, and we were talking about art, we were talking about comedy, and I was saying that the best comedy is born out of cruelty and is born out of pain. And I think that could certainly be said about music too. So I want to go back to the beginning. So the world knows you as a mathematician. When did maths enter your life? When did you realise that it was something that you loved and you had aptitude at?
At grade 2, I remember coming home from school, and I had just learned...
So grade 2 for a British person is how old?
Oh, thank you. That would be 8 years old. Yeah. So I remember coming home from school, and I had just learned about multiplying by 2, and I got up to 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and I got up to 4,096, and I can remember thinking, I could do this forever. So that kind of thinking in an 8-year-old is pretty good. I will say that after that, I moved to Canada. That was in the United Kingdom, in Belfast. After that, I moved to Canada, and whatever went wrong, the transition did not go well for me, and I ended up failing grade 5, mathematics included. So I couldn't do long division by grade 5. So I was in a bad space, education-wise. Yeah.
So I mean, did you have a natural aptitude for maths, or was it something hard learned? Because maths seems to me very much like sport. To be really good at it, you have to be naturally good at it.
Yes, I think to be a world-class mathematician, you absolutely have to put together hard work plus good genes. And I would say that I'm not a great mathematician. I'm creative, but I'm certainly not a great mathematician. So I really enjoy designing puzzles for the elementary and junior high curriculum. So that's in your first 9 years of schooling. I love designing puzzles, and I'm very creative at designing puzzles for that age group. Top-level mathematics, not so much.
When I hear stories about mathematicians, I'm always quite drawn to the kind of people. There's a famous British mathematician, I can't remember his name, who said, I hope none of my mathematics ever has any utility. And I quite enjoy that sort of notion of doing mathematics just for the sake of it. Do you see maths in that sense as an art form as much as a utilitarian pursuit?
I see it much more as an art form than in a utilitarian pursuit. That was I think that was Hardy who said that, and I think it was with respect to the fact that he was working with prime numbers and number theory, and the fact is that became very practical because now internet security is based on the RSA, let me figure out what does RSA stand for again? I'm not going to get it. But anyway, the prime numbers that he was working on ended up to be extremely practical in the end. So
I assume he'd be spinning in his grave now at that thought.
I think it's just totally irrelevant to him. Probably, like we do maths. Most mathematicians, I think, do maths because they are incredibly beautiful, and they're pure in the same type of way that a beautiful game is pure, not in a way that expresses emotions. Why music is number one for me is it expresses emotions. If I was a composer and you listen to my music 400 years from now, you could probably figure out what I felt like, what kind of a person I was, a little bit. With Santorini, 400 years from now, you can't tell anything about me, apart that I could create a game. So that's a difference.
But I think games are more about eliciting emotion rather than evoking them. Right? How the creator felt when creating it is by the by, whereas with music, to have an insight into the soul of the creator is part of the joy, no?
Yes, I totally agree with that. But with the music, you can I can imagine that I'm feeling something like Victoria might have felt whenever he composed his Requiem. I can imagine the fear that Shostakovich felt. So I can both understand Shostakovich and I can see that within myself. So there is a deeper connection with music than there is with any other art form for me, including games.
And so do you have any mathematicians that particularly inspired you, or mathematicians that our listeners should go and look up and see whether they had particularly eventful lives, they did particularly eventful things?
Surprisingly, the number one mathematician that inspired me was a guy called Richard Guy. And he wrote a book called Unsolved Problems in Number Theory. And I found this book in the University of Calgary library. And I was totally taken by this book. This is in my undergraduate days. And I later found out that, of course, Richard Guy lives in Calgary, and he's now 102 years old. He's the oldest functioning mathematician. The guy's absolutely amazing. And here was my guru sitting on my doorstep, and I just digested his book, the Unsolved Problems in Number Theory. I just digested that book without even knowing that he was right in my backyard.
And so did you get to meet him?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We now know each other, and so that's a great story.
And so what they say about meeting your heroes is not true then?
I have met two of my heroes now, two of my top heroes. He was number one, and whenever he went, whenever I discovered him, then Tadashi Takeda, the Japanese mathematician and toy explorer, he became my number one person that I wanted to meet in my life, and I met him. And so now I've met two of my top people, and I have the next person is to come.
And who is that?
He's a guy called Knuth, and he did fantastic work on computer science years ago. So he's in California. So I hope to meet him one day.
And so when did games enter your life? Hobby games specifically?
So mazes entered first at age 3. Games came, the earliest memory I have of games is probably age 5. I had a family that was only moderately into games. So I can remember playing Isola, chess, cards, occasionally with them. But more often than not, I had to play all of the different positions around a table because there was no one else to play. So that was my growing up. It sounds lonely, but it wasn't. Yeah, it sounds pretty dismal, but it really wasn't.
I think children are much more willing to put up with their own company than adults are.
So I played many, many, many games. Santorini, I would have played hundreds of games against myself in the mid-1980s. Yeah.
And so what do you think, the relationship between games and mathematics? And people have asked me, are you ever going to design a game? And my rote answer is, my brain doesn't work in that way. How important do you think it is to have a handle on maths when designing games?
Well, it's certainly it's certainly what inspires me. I am inspired by the beauty of mathematics to design puzzles and to design games. I often have a visual in mind ahead of mechanics and ahead of theme. That was true of Santorini. I had a poster on my wall of corporate executives climbing these white skyscrapers. And that is what stimulated me to design Santorini in 1985. And linking up that aesthetic with mechanism, I think that is a mathematical, for me, that is a mathematical trait. It is what helps me in mathematics, and so I think that's true. But that's certainly not true for all board game designers.
And so your first game then is a game that, if I was to say to someone, I'm interviewing a mathematician this evening and tell me what kind of game he's going to choose, this wouldn't come to mind, I don't think. And this is Resistance Avalon. So why have you chosen this one? What is it about this game that encourages it to be one of your 5 games for Doomsday?
First of all, it is a game that I never could have created myself. Second of all, it is a game that I have had the most joy with over the last 10 years. I can just remember so many times just laughing my head off with me thinking somebody is evil and they're good, or thinking... anyway, it was... I've had the best of times with this game. What does it have to do with mathematics? I really think that we should abolish elementary school mathematics and just replace it with problem solving. And Avalon allows people two ways to solve the game. The first is to read people really well, to look at their faces. Are they lying? Are they telling the truth? The second is through the logic. How did they vote in the past? Okay, they voted like this, like this. Why would they vote like that if they were good? So there's two very different ways to approach this game. I think it's absolutely stunningly engaging. I've had great fun with it myself. I've had great fun with it introducing it to schools. So that's why it's on my list.
And so, have you ever had situations? I found this game. It was one of the first games I bought, and I've played it to death, and it is wonderful. But occasionally, you'll get a group that is just really contentious, and you sit there and watch a group of people rip themselves to shreds for 45 minutes. Have you ever experienced that playing this?
No, but that probably just says more about my friends versus your friends.
I mean, it could be that they're Canadian, and, you know, Canadians do have the reputation for being the nicest people on the planet. So I want to move on now and talk about Math Pickle. So firstly, can you explain for the listeners what Math Pickle is?
So I started Math Pickle in 2010. I had just had a very bad car crash that no one was hurt in, but I just decided, okay, I need to get out my ideas of math education sooner rather than later. I started counting the days after that crash. Math Pickle was what I came up with as what I was going to do for the world. And I put out everything for free. Everything remains for free. I'm not asking teachers to pay anything. I'm not asking for any ads for them to watch any ads. I just want it totally free. And just I've designed puzzles again and again and again that I think are absolutely beautiful and engaging for a full spectrum of student ability. That's what I'm after. I want 95% of students to be engaged. The top kids, I want them to be engaged because the puzzle's interesting. I want the bottom kids to be engaged because they can see that the top kids are struggling, so they don't have to have math anxiety. They might not solve this. I adore designing these puzzles. So that's the first thing that Math Pickle is about, is me designing puzzles. The second thing it's about is taking unsolved problems from the last 150 years and taking a few of them, and there's surprisingly many, that can be reformulated in a way that elementary kids can understand and can grapple with. Those are the big two things that Math Pickle does, and I think it does it pretty well.
So this car crash you had was then something of a Damascene moment, and you decided that you needed to leave a legacy. And did it sort of hit you that life was short? Absolutely. The life of my whole family could have been over. The crash was entirely my fault. And so I just said, okay, it's time to give to the world. I started to give in the way that I thought I could give best. And how successful do you think that brief has been with regards to Math Pickle? So Math Pickle is financially unsound. It does not make any money. So I'm dependent on support because I'm not seeking money overtly. I'm dependent on support from angel investors who understand that I want no strings attached. You trust me to come up with a continual stream of interesting puzzles. So compare that to Santorini, which was immediately financially quite viable. It was a very interesting bolt
from the blue to have Santorini to balance the math pickle financial non-existence of any financial strategy, and to have math pickle to have Santorini just jump on and suddenly solve all sorts of financial issues.
And so you sent me a really, really interesting sort of diagram when I asked you for a bio, and this was the sort of foundational quotes of Math Pickle, the things that sort of inspired you and continue to. And one of them that really stood out to me was, teaching is an experimental science. What does that mean in practicality when you're in a classroom faced with the tyranny of 1,000 little eyes?
First of all, I think it means for new teachers, you should expect your first year to be your worst year teaching. 100% you should expect that. You will learn so much your first year teaching that will hold you in good stead for your future years. Your second year teaching will probably be your second worst year teaching. Teachers should be encouraged to experiment. They should experiment on students. They should see, does this work? Does this not work? I tell, whenever I'm going into a school, I tell that school, I will be experimenting on your students. Not all that I do will work, but now I have a track record, and because other schools in the past allowed me to experiment, I'm now at a point that I can be pretty sure that 90% of what I experiment, it'll be a success. But I will fail, and I'll be honest with it, and I'll tell you, this really didn't work. And I can remember some doozies of failures that are not, they're not obvious. Handing out worksheets, for example, or puzzle sheets as I call them. I always handed out puzzle sheets, one for every 2 children. And one class, this was a beautiful puzzle sheet, I handed out one to an extra one to a child, and then another child come up, and she wanted her own. And sooner I had the whole class with their own puzzle sheets. And everything seemed to be going well. They seemed to be really engaged, and kids were coming up to me and asking questions, and everything looked good. And then 3/4 of the way through the class, I found a girl who had just not done anything. And I was so sad. She had just been sitting there. And I realized one of the reasons I hand out one puzzle sheet for every 2 people is that a duo of students tend to fail in a vocal way. It's obvious for me. I can look across the classroom and I can see, that duo is failing. They're not engaged. But I can't always tell that whenever a single student is failing, because they can be introverted in their failure. So that was an example of me failing. That's an experimental science.
I mean, how would you feel if a parent were to say, all this is great in principle and it sounds very good, and, you know, you should improve the science by experimentation, but I just don't want you experimenting on my kid? How do you deal with that? Well,
I don't. I just say, no, that's the reality. You can't get away with it. It's true in medicine. It should be true in education as well. We just have to accept as a society that experimenting is the way to move forward. You don't want to be redesigning the whole math curriculum every 5 years with a new fad. Instead, you want to be experimenting with a subgroup of schools. You say, let's see, does this particular change work or not? So in that way, you can start from any starting point and you can evolve to something better. That's just something that parents have to get used to and have to understand. This is the way we improve as a society.
And so when I was at school, we got to a certain age, sort of third year at school, so sort of 14 years old. And then they would stream us. So they would stream us in mathematics and they would stream us in English. You'd have a top, middle and a bottom group. And I've been speaking to people about this, and I'm not sure about what I think about that, whether it's beneficial or not. What is your opinion on that? Do you think children should be separated based upon their aptitude level at some point?
That is possible. I'm going to remain agnostic on that. I will say that the worst situation that we have here in Canada is that kids are kept in the same grade, but the parents complain to the teacher that their child is doing really, really well. They need to be accelerated through the curriculum. And so you end up with these children hop, skipping, and jumping from success to success to success, very gifted kids, and then hitting university and splat. They are used to success all their life, and their first experience of failure is at university. That is crazy. Failure has to be built in to our education system as a fundamental learning tool, as a fundamental learning objective. So in kindergarten, I tell kids, oh, you failed. But I do it in a kind of a tongue-in-cheek way at the start. By grade 2, I'll be quite direct with kids. Oh, no, clearly that didn't work. And to be comfortable with failure and to make sure that teachers teach failure, that's really important.
And so you mentioned something in the notes that you gave me of a math pickle $1,000 million problem. What is this? So
in 2013, we got a group of math educators and mathematicians together in Banff, Canada, and we looked through unsolved problems, and we chose one unsolved problem for each grade K through 12. These were problems that were curricular, and they were problems that were unsolved, and I thought, this really needs a huge impetus to get this out into the media. So I suggested at that meeting that that we should seek $1 million for each of these 13 unsolved problems. There was a lot of resistance against that, and a lot of people that were pro it. So it separated the group. There was not consensus on it. And so we decided to wait for 5 years and see if these problems would just be picked up by the media, by social media, and they haven't. So it clearly needs to get those problems out there and to get them the media attention that they deserve. $1 million, I think, is the most effective way to get those problems the worldwide exposure that they need.
So how do you propose to find $13 million?
I don't know. I was approached by one of the people associated with Google, the founding members of that, and one of the widows of one of the people who died there. And she was interested, and after that it just fizzled out. So I actually have no idea how I'm going to fund it. It's the kind of thing that might happen posthumously after I die. People might say, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea. I think that it is the most efficient way that we can, that $13 million could be used to improve math education worldwide. That's my hunch. There's lots of people that have legitimate concerns with it. Does it cheapen mathematics because kids are going to be thinking, oh, it's all about money? I don't know. I tend to think that cheapening is overestimated. I think that there's no other way for this to get down to South America, to South Africa. I think that the only way is to get a huge monetary pump into these puzzles and problems.
So your next game is Urbino. And why is this going to the cabin?
There had to be an abstract strategy game. And Go is too easy, okay? So yeah, I could have put in Go.
Did you think it was too gauche to take Santorini?
I just decided to end up choosing the game that I feel like playing most right now, and that is Urbino. So Urbino is a game that is absolutely elegant. It's by Dieter Stein. I just came across it in Essen 2 years ago, and definitely a game that I don't understand. I would love to delve into that game deeply. The other game that I considered was Devon. It's the game that I played best. of all of the games that I own or have ever owned, Devon is the only one that I would say I play at a very high level. I would love to be able to understand Urbino more.
And do you think abstracts are the sort of purest expression of games?
I like games that have minimalist rules. That's the way I design games. I think that subjecting people to lots of rules is painful. I like the way that Santorini does it, where the base rules are easy, and then whenever you pick up new gods, you can learn what they do. But I really like abstract strategy games because generally the rule set is sparse. If you've got an abstract strategy game where the rule set is dense, I think you have a problem. I think chess, I don't have a lot of time for chess now whenever I'm going into schools. If they have a chess club already, that's great. But I would never suggest chess as a place for people to start with a pure strategy game.
And so do you think that the notion of easy to learn, difficult to master, especially with abstract games, is the goal?
For me as a designer, yes. It's why I respect Chris Berm at the very top of designers, because again and again he has created beautiful, simple mechanisms that create a wealth of gameplay and complexity. Beautiful.
So I spoke to Uli Blenneman and asked him what's different about this new version of Die Macher.
Yeah, first I think that even the 1986 edition is still a modern game nowadays if you would play it. So really Die Macher was ahead of its time. But of course some things had to be changed. So let's start with the topics. So there are 7 topics in the game, for example, one of the topics is if your party is against the euro or for the euro, so that it is to be introduced in Germany and in Europe. And of course this has been long been done, and some of the other topics in German politics have changed as well. But this was pretty much an easy change or a graphics change. But Kalle has introduced some changes to the engine as well. So for example, how to get votes has been simplified and streamlined. Then there were some random elements in the early edition. So you had a die to roll for a few things. The die has been removed. And for example, the polls were completely random. But in the new edition, you can see from the back of the card, so from the flip side, what the polls likely can be. So you know a little bit, but not everything. But everything has been brought up to date, but the basic engine of Die Macher is still intact. And last but not least, the game, there is still the old version of 7 elections, 7 federal state elections, which means that you are playing for 4 hours or more. But at the same time, there is a new version with just 4 federal state elections. So this, is, of course, has the playing time reduced by probably at least an hour.
Find out all the information soon at spielworks.de. And so, Urbino, how does this stand out from other abstracts?
It stands out for me because it's stunningly beautiful. Most abstracts are. I guess it's because I feel I have such a long way to go to really understand and to really play this at a high level. I've got a long way to go. With Go, I can watch experts play online. And I'm not a great Go player, but I would say every third move, I could predict where they're going to play. That's a very awesome feeling. There's no online videos of Urbino, so I'm by myself there. And I would love to figure this game out.
And so what would you say to people like me who find abstracts difficult? I mean, actually, in fact, with things like Azul and Patchwork, I'm kind of finding myself drawn more to them. But people who would say that abstracts are nothing but dry, boring, uninviting things, what would you say to them?
Well, first of all, the term abstract is a confusing term for me. I like pure strategy to refer to games that do not include Azul, because there's luck in Azul. I'm happy to call Azul an abstract. I think that's an appropriate use of the word, but that's not what most people mean by abstract. They mean an abstract pure strategy game, which, for example, would not necessarily include Santorini, which has a strong theme to it. So the words have been kind of confused in this whole genre. Abstract, Azul, I think Azul is a fantastic game, it didn't get on my list, but it was certainly the single game that I was happy to lose the Spiel des Jahres to, Santorini versus Azul. I can see that Azul might beat Santorini. I think it's a stunningly produced game, beautifully rendered, beautiful mechanistic ideas. I'm a big fan.
And so, moving on, another thing that stood out to me in this collection of quotes you show me on the Math Pickle thing was a quote that said, "Choose puzzles and games as if the 8-year-old genius Gauss is in the front row and the 8-year-old delinquent Churchill is in the back." How important is it to be able to tailor a class that bridges all ability levels? And do you think puzzles are the best way to do this?
I think that is what teaching is about, is being able to engage the fullest possible spectrum of students, as opposed to tutoring. Tutoring, you can customize to just a single student in front of you. That's an extremely different skill set than a teacher. That's a job of a teacher, to engage the full spectrum of students. But to do that well, you need to have at your disposal puzzles that are capable of engaging the full spectrum of students. So many worksheets are... okay, imagine that I'm now in front of a grade 2 classroom, that's 8-year-olds, and they're learning addition. I can guarantee you in the United Kingdom, in Germany and Canada, probably 20% of those kids know how to add before you even open your mouth. And another 20% of the kids are struggling with last year's just counting. So how do you engage that full classroom? You can't hand out a worksheet that has 4 plus 6 because that is utterly boring to the 20% of the class that's at the top. So you need to encapsulate your lesson on addition inside a larger problem that is much more difficult. And those 20% of your kids who are at that top level, you are deflecting them all the time into problem solving. And that is never a waste of time. That's really the number one thing we want out of math education in elementary school, is that kids learn how to think. So you deflect those top kids into problem solving, the bottom kids and the medium kids, you just work towards them gaining a mastery of addition. That's a snapshot of the decisions that a teacher needs to make to be awesome. They need to choose awesome puzzles to support their number one objective, and that is to engage a full spectrum of student ability.
And so is this, on practical terms, giving one set of puzzles to certain kids, different puzzles to other kids?
You need to be able to stand in front of the classroom and describe the same puzzle to all of your kids, to engage them all with that puzzle. Then there is a time that I would differentiate in most of my puzzles, or maybe half my puzzles, there's a time to differentiate right pretty soon. After they go back to their desks, they sit together with their partner, and you hand out a sheet. But not always. Some of the puzzles are just naturally so deep that you can teach addition with the same sheet in front of you as you can say, oh goodness, how am I going to solve that? So this you have to see some of the Math Pickle videos to understand that. But that's absolutely true.
So when I was at school, I remember, I would speak to my mum about homework, and I'd speak to her about maths, and she would always say, oh, I was never good at maths at school. And there was that sort of general public sort of apathy about mathematics. Is this still the case? And if so, does a maths teacher have to be a maths evangelist too?
I think it's actually quite easy to get math to a position where it is the second most favorite class in school. I think that's not a huge effort for really top math teachers. I think it's very difficult to beat physical education as the number one. I think most kids still enjoy just running around as they're shooting a basketball. But getting to the second most favorite class, I think that's pretty easy. And you do that through a puzzling mentality about being like presenting Sudoku-like puzzles. I don't support Sudoku in the classroom, but you can imagine that there's a lot of people who naturally enjoy Sudoku. Well, that's the same type of thing that you should be going for in your math classroom, is to get that natural attraction to just enjoying puzzling and solving problems. It can be a joy.
I mean, it's interesting because you say that, and I've in my life witnessed loads of people who play Sudoku, and if you were to say to them, "Wow, you're doing maths," they would say, "Don't be stupid. I'm doing Sudoku. Maths is boring." I mean, do you think there's mileage in explaining to people that look at those things you do in your life? This is actually mathematics. Mathematics is not separate from fun.
So first of all, with Sudoku, it's not that you're dealing with numbers that makes it mathematical. You could be dealing with A, B, C, D, E, and that would be equally mathematical. What is mathematical there is the problem solving at the core. Sudoku, you need to problem solve. That is the number one objective of the math classroom, is to get kids to problem solve, to increase their rigor in solving these problems. And that's what people need to move away from, mathematics being all about arithmetic in elementary school, and more that the arithmetic supports problem solving.
And so you say, I watched a video where you were recommending games for kids, and you say that the best way to support maths at home is not by doing worksheets, but by beating your children at games. Are you one of these parents that shows no quarter to your children when you play games with them?
It depends on the child. My son, who's now age 13, I could show no quarter to. I beat him 85% of the time in war games, Memoir 44, for example. And after the game, we would just dissect. Oh, the Germans went here, and the Americans did this, and we would just enjoy it. My daughter, entirely different. My daughter needs to win 50% of the time, and I try to keep it at 50%. There's ways that I fake it. For example, I purposely make non-optimal moves the first 3 moves in the game that we're playing, and then I try to play really well after that. So that's the way that I still enjoy a game, and it's still exciting for me to try to win, but I purposely make bad moves at the start.
So sort of unconditional honesty with regards to playing games optimally, you don't think is necessary to sort of, because there seems to be this push and pull between, indulging your kids and letting them win, or being absolutely brutal in terms of they've got to learn failure. I mean, how important is failure to children?
I think failure is absolutely essential. I would say that books are equally important as games for two entirely different reasons. And in my house, I've got a nice library and I've got a nice board game library. And what do board games teach? They teach sociability, they teach failure, standing up, dusting yourself off and trying again. They also teach that this set of rules are rigid, but only in this game. Then you can forget about them. That's very useful for a mathematician mindset. Too often mathematics is one layer on top of another on top of another. That's the way mathematics is taught, all of which are true. Well, that's fine, but I think there's a lot of interest that can be generated in the mathematics classroom by saying, okay, in this class, this is going to be true, only for this class. That's a very similar way of dealing with the math classroom as dealing with a board game. Only in this game are certain rules true.
And so your next game then is one I must confess I hadn't heard of until I got your list. And this is Warsaw City of Ruins. So what draws you to this game?
First of all, it's extremely elegant. It's beautifully packaged. You open it up. The rules read very simply. You then try to teach it to someone, and you find that you can teach that to someone while playing the game. This is an enormous positive for me as a gamer, because I'm so often introducing people to new games. So I can introduce just a few rules at the very start and then let them fly. The next thing you notice about the game is that there's very little downtime. It's a drafting system like Seven Wonders, but oh my gosh, it's just a slick drafting system. You're expanding Warsaw. World War II comes, World War I comes, and World War II comes, and you're losing tiles. So I feel like it's beautifully historical in a minimalist kind of way. I just think this game has got no flaws. I think it's absolutely a masterpiece.
And so you call it, in your notes, you call it a hidden gem of modern game design. Why do you think it's not more popular?
I think it just luck. It's probably a little bit too complex to go into, to be a crossover game into Walmart or something like that. So it's not going to be beside Santorini on a shelf. But it needs to be played by gamers way more. This really is a game that you need to pick up and experiment with.
And so you say that it goes through the history of Warsaw and has the First World War and the Second World War.
Yeah, very, very minimalist. I'm not saying it's in any way a deep game in that sense. You have choices in games. You can become it can become a simulation, which has incredible detail, or you can be very minimalistic. This is a very minimalistic history of Warsaw with real buildings in Warsaw on some of the cards.
But do you think it's one of those games that kind of inspires you to go off and read books and see what syncs with the events in the game?
It hasn't for me, but maybe other people, that's the way that they're inspired. Not for me.
So I want to talk now about your game design. And I'm interested in this because I interviewed someone else, and they were talking about how they don't like Eurogames because essentially there's nothing different between a Eurogame and a puzzle. Eurogames are solvable and puzzles are, and they're not games in that sense. To what degree are games puzzles and vice versa?
I think that some games, for example, the Warsaw City of Ruins, you can be a little bit separate from the other players and just solve your own little board, your own little city, and try to be optimal there. So in that sense, there are some games that are more puzzly, less interaction. But I think that's the definition of a game, is that you do have interaction with other players.
And so what drew you into designing board games then? So was that just a natural evolution from puzzles?
Board games came first. Cosmic Encounters at about age 9 was my first experience of board games. And board game design is I designed the cards, extra aliens for Cosmic Encounters. So that's by far the most inspirational game in my history. So I designed probably 50 aliens for Cosmic Encounters. Just had a blast doing that. And that's the way I would, by the way, encourage other people to get into board game design, is not to design a game from scratch, but to take an existing game and to tweak some of the cards and move forward that way. And
so you said that Santorini you designed in the mid-'80s, and I was looking at Board Game Geek to see when it first came out, and I think the first printing came out in the early 2000s, and then the Roxley one. So what was the origin of Santorini, and why did it take so long for you to get to the point where it was published?
So it was inspired by that poster that I saw on my beside my bed that I'd put up. It was that graphic of corporate executives climbing those white skyscrapers. So that was in 1985, December, and I was in the middle of midterm exams, and I just woke up one day and I thought, I could design a game based on that. And half an hour later, I had the base game. It was on a 4x4 board, and I played Santorini on a 4x4 board for the next 2 years. The 4x4 board is fairer. The 5x5 has an advantage for the first player, but nevertheless the games are more exciting on the 5x5 board, which is why I eventually switched permanently to the 5x5. And I was just a business disaster. I sent that game to so many publishers over the years, and just got nothing back. Gigamic, the French designer, I think in 1999, they shortlisted it as one of their top 10 games, but it never got published. And finally, I just gave up and published 160 copies in my basement, and that's the white aesthetic that you see on Board Game Geek before the Roxley version.
And so how did the Roxley reprint come about?
So the game at that time, Family Games America had bought the rights to Santorini in 2009, and by 2014 they had decided not to do anything with it. So the rights revoked to me in 2014, at which point Gavin from Roxley said, yeah, Gord, we need to do this. So I said, absolutely. So I think it was one of the happiest moments of my life when I saw the first 3D visual of one of the Santorini towers that Gavin had proposed, and then the God cards started to come out. It's clearly one of the happiest moments of my life, because at that point I knew this game was going to be absolutely huge. Objectively I knew that this game is going to be big, because I knew the mechanisms were the best thing I had ever done in my life, including my PhD thesis. It had no look-in compared to Santorini. Santorini was by far the more inspired part of my life. So, yeah.
And when you saw it there, in its full publication, and it really does look like you're building Santorini. The buildings really do look like those buildings in Santorini. How did that make you feel? Is it explainable?
I'm still basking in the light of Santorini Roxley version. I'm so in love with the aesthetic that Gavin brought to it. I loved my aesthetic of all white. and I argued for that. But whenever Gavin showed me the beautiful thing that he could do to make this game accessible to younger kids, because I was playing Santorini in the kindergarten classroom with kids actually standing on big blocks. So I knew the game was accessible to younger kids, but of course my all-white version would not have appealed. So Gavin was fantastic in, I guess, seeing that and just creating something so whimsical that it would appeal to the full spectrum from age 6 to age 102.
And so, how well has Santorini done? Do you know how many copies has it sold? And I mean, it seemed to herald this sort of new wave of abstract games. And then to what degree do you think that you've had a hand in the repopularization of abstracts?
Again, I don't consider it an abstract. I consider it a pure strategy game for the most part, although some of the gods take you away from pure strategy. Hecate is my favorite god to play, and she plays invisibly. So I don't think that I really belong in the abstract gaming world. That's not what Santorini looks like. The original game looked abstract, the white version, but not the Roxley version. That's fully themed.
And so what is coming for you in the future with regards to game design? Do you have anything else coming out?
Well, I promised myself that I did a lot of design in the 1990s, but I promised myself if I could not get Santorini published, there was no point in me trying to do anything else on the game line. So all of those games that I worked on back then, they're all there and ready to explore. So again, my problem is that I'm so totally not a businessman. I'm so totally not practical that I went to Essen and I did I remember to bring business cards? I don't know, but I showed up at different booths, and of course you were supposed to phone ahead and to make arrangements to go into these booths. So of course I have no relationships with publishers except for Gavin after 2 years. So I'm an abysmal business person.
And so you said that Santorini is sort of your greatest achievement, surpassing your PhD thesis. Did you always know? And was it demoralizing having something that you were sure was great and sort of the quintessence of your expression go unrecognized for so long? Did you ever become despondent about that?
Oh, every time I thought about it, it was miserable. After, like, 1985 is when I came up with it. For all of those years, I knew this was the best thing I had done until I in the late 1990s, I came up with Calculus, the board game Calculus, which I thought, okay, this is really good. I really liked some of the ideas there. And then Chinenman in 2014. I really liked some of the games, some of the ideas there, and then I'd come up with a whole bunch of other games that I didn't put on the web. But so I've had other successes in my own mind. The fact that Santorini might be selling, I don't know how many copies we're up to now, but in the hundreds of thousands, versus Calculus, which has sold less than 50, and Chinenman, which I don't think is played by more than 50 people, I'm still equally as excited about those unsuccessful games. That's only worldly success. I designed Chinenman specifically to go viral in China. I had no expectations to sell it to anybody. It hasn't gone viral in China, so, but I still think it's a very, very interesting game.
So your next game is possibly the classic to end all classics, and this is Dungeons and Dragons. Do you have a long history with D&D?
My history with D&D started and stopped at age 15, so this is my nostalgic choice. I have not explored role-playing games at all. I'd be very happy for someone to come along and say, oh, you maybe want to try this role-playing game instead on your list. but I definitely want to go back to that with my son and get him to experience role-playing games. So I'm really looking forward to that in the next year.
Yeah, I think D&D is absolutely amazing. It does absolutely everything, and I think it's a game that's great for writers, it's great for actors, it's great for performers. Even when you're not working, you can sort of sharpen your craft with it. But also, it seems to be hugely accessible, and Wizards of the Coast have really worked towards that with this new edition, I think. But what do you think it is about D&D? Do you think first mover advantage is important in gaming?
Of course there is. But I will say that many of the dungeon crawlers that have been turned into board games, for me, fail because they fail to recognize that the reason that Dungeons & Dragons was so successful was not all about the dice rolling, it was all about the storytelling. I would like to play, even if I didn't have electricity and my cabin was in darkness. I would be playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I would set the other people up in the room without any light. We could still play a modified version without any dice rolling. That's the kind of thing that I think is fundamental to Dungeons and Dragons, is the storytelling.
So I want to talk to you now as a mathematician. And it seems to me that the development of role-playing games is an attempt to fix D&D, especially if you look at sort of the dice rolling, the attempt to fix the mathematics. So how good do you think the D20 is as a main die for a role-playing game? Or do you just think it's too swingy?
Well, life is swingy, so I'm quite happy to have very swingy dungeon master roles. That did not bug me whenever I was 15. I would doubt it would bug me now. It's possible that there is another role-playing game that I need to compare and contrast with Dungeons and Dragons. I'm ignorant on the subject. I know that if I was in a cabin by myself even, designing a dungeon lair would be an enjoyable pastime. So there's all sorts of reasons for that game to be one of the 5.
So I want to talk now about the future. So you talked a little bit about, designing other games, but where do you see sort of Math Pickle in the coming years? And do you want that to develop into something different?
I will never give up on Math Pickle. I hope that Santorini will give me enough support that I can just run Math Pickle on the side. I get puzzle ideas and game ideas in about the same frequency. They bounce off each other. It's the same skill set. So I hope to be doing both for the remainder of my life.
And so it seems to me that part of your desire as an educator, and I guess this is obvious, is to bring your subject to as many people as possible. How do we stop kids being apathetic about maths? How do we make them realise that maths is a valuable, vibrant and vital thing to be involved with?
It's really just choosing those problems that you give to kids. Choose them carefully. Choose them so that they're awesome, interesting, engaging puzzles. And you'll have no problem. Stand up in front of the class and fail yourself every so often and get relaxed about failing yourself. You're being a good role model as a teacher if you do that. There's so many great resources now, and I hope Math Pickle is one of them. So teachers should get out there. I know that you're time pressured. I know it's a difficult profession, but if you can just spend a few minutes a day to find a really good problem, you do not need to put that same time into learning the answer for the problem. So you can actually go out and have a beer instead of memorizing the answers to the problems that you're going to be teaching the next day. So in the long term, I think you're going to be saving time and you're going to have a more joyous classroom with kids that don't trust you. I love if I go into a classroom and the kids aren't sure if I'm telling the truth or not, and if they can't quite trust what I'm saying, that's a nice, gritty kind of mathematical experience for the kids.
So your last game is a game that caused quite a sensation when it first came out, and I think for me is one of the most succinct designs I've seen in a long time, and this is Star Realms. What is it about Star Realms that you like?
Well, you've named succinct is exactly a good word. Elegant, minimalist, and yet keeping so much gameplay. Absolutely a fantastic game to follow on the mega boxes that I have of Dominion. Now, I enjoy Dominion, but cost-wise, if I'm recommending a game for families to buy, I do not recommend Dominion. I have to say that Star Realms, for the game that fits in my back pocket, oh my gosh, Star Realms is marvelous. I would even say Star Realms Frontiers is maybe even better than the original. It's a fantastic game again. I can't say enough positive adjectives to describe this. I've had great experiences. Again, my son and I play a lot of this, and it would be near top of my list to recommend for any duo. So yeah, awesome.
And so, do you think it's the way it introduces competitive direct competition that makes it so interesting?
I think that they came up with some very nice mechanistic ideas in the game. Number one, of course, is that if you have a faction, that's okay. But if you have two of that faction in your hand, then you have bonus abilities. So that forces you to really consider specializing. That is a very, very nice core mechanism, and one that I wish that I had come up with. That was within my realm to design that, but I didn't. I'm sad.
So, one more question then. So you're heading off to the cabin. You're hurtling out of the city and you're going down the road and you go around a corner and you haven't closed the back door correctly and it flies open and 4 of your games fly out down a ravine into a river and are swept away for posterity. Which game do you hope is sitting in the backseat of the car?
So I'm going to say that I'm assuming that there's other cabins somewhere that I might be linking up with in the future years. So I'm going to choose Warsaw City of Ruins because many other cabins won't have that. So I think that is going to be my game of choice. It's a game that absolutely belongs in everyone's cabin.
So if people want to get in touch with you, have a look at MathPickle, how would they go about doing that?
Gord@mathpickle.com is my email address, and mathpickle.com is the website. Everything's for free. So come on over, have a look, give me an email on any topic.
Well, Gordon Hamilton, thank you very much.
Take care, Ben.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can give a rolling donation to help support the show at patreon.com/5G4D, or a one-time PayPal donation at the bottom of the website 5gamesfordoomsday.com. Also, if you're feeling snazzy, you can buy a t-shirt at tpublic.com/user/5gamesfordoomsday. And if I haven't had to limp off to the underbrush to get away from the animated Bast statues and the people who thought Anton LaVey actually believed in Satan, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.